And a very warm welcome back from the break. I hope you took the opportunity to have some nourishment and a little bit of movement and perhaps rest your eyes from the screen. Our next panel is on unlocking the research pipeline and bridging the gaps between clinical trials and real-world genomics. The ability to translate genomic data into actionable evidence is becoming increasingly critical. This session examines how real-world CGP data and coordinated genomic infrastructure can strengthen Canada's research ecosystem, particularly where traditional trial evidence is limited. By focusing on data integration, evidence generation, and national coordination, the discussion will consider how genomics can better inform research, regulatory, and system-level decision-making, and support a more connected pan-Canadian approach to precision oncology innovation. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Stephanie Michaud, President and CEO of Biocan RX, and a valued member of CRAN's Medical and Scientific Advisory Board, who will be moderating this discussion. We welcome Dylan Eisenhower, stage 4 colorectal cancer patient and founder of Second Look Cancer, who will be representing the patient perspective. Dr. Yvonne Bombard, Canada Research Chair in Genomics Health Services and Policy at Unity Health Toronto and Director of the Genomics Health Services Research Program at St. Michael's Hospital, and another valued member of CRAN's Medical and Scientific Advisory Board. Dr. Jim Woodgett, President and Scientific Director of the Terry Fox Research Institute, and Dr. Arvind Dasari, Director of Clinical Research at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas. So as we get back into the programming following lunch, I will encourage our audience again to continue to engage with the discussion through the question and comment bar and keep the web wall feature open on your screens. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Cassandra, and good morning, good afternoon to all of those that are joining us today. It's my distinct pleasure to be here with this group of experts that are going to discuss for the next hour, and of course, we're reserving about 15 minutes for audience questions, and we encourage you to ask the questions given the quality and exceptional expertise on this panel today. So as Cassandra has mentioned, we will be looking and discussing the gaps between GCP and research, in particular as it relates to clinical trials and translational research. We have a few objectives for this session today. One is, of course, to examine what the gaps are in terms of clinical trial inclusion for metastatic cancer patients that are eligible for comprehensive genomic profiling, and what that means with respect to impact on their ability to access clinical trials. So really having to do with the inclusion criteria. We're also going to speak about real-world genomic data and how this can be used, how it is used to inform patient-centered policy and system decision-making. And we're also going to discuss how national genomic repositories, data sharing platforms can support a coordinated pan-Canadian research and innovation strategy. And lastly, we will also be discussing how collaborative research models that integrate GCP into clinical and translational studies can benefit patients. So to kick us off this morning, I'd like to turn it on over to Dylan and Jim, and to pose this first question with respect to Objective 1, which is really about discussing that gap between GCP and what it means with respect to clinical trial inclusion. I'm going to ask Dylan to kick us off and ask you the following question, Dylan. Your patient diagnosed with metastatic cancer, and you have experienced firsthand the challenges of navigating clinical trial opportunities, and I've been made aware of the incredible initiative that you have launched with respect to Second Look Cancer. Despite the advances that we've seen in biomarker testing and comprehensive genomic profiling, what barriers do patients continue to face when trying to identify and access relevant clinical trials?
I think one kind of big point from a patient perspective is just the education and awareness side of things. Um, Even if they have received these testings, they may not be aware of them or be able to access the test, on their portal or wherever they can access that data. But even further than that, if they do know that information, it's very difficult to find where clinical trials are being made or being run out of. So that's really where Second Look came in to kind of aggregate all that information just from CT.gov and make it a lot easier for patients to find trials and where they are. So I think that's probably the biggest gap right now from a patient perspective. There's about 1,000 people on the platform, and about 20% at the onset don't know their biomarkers. So that kind of gives an example, and these are probably people that are the most interested in clinical trials too, that are on the platform. So that's uh that's where I think I look at the biggest gap right now.
A follow-up question for you in that a number of patients would appear to be eligible for a clinical trial on paper, but never ultimately participate. And what do you see as the biggest factor contributing to that gap?
Yeah, I think there's lots of stats running out there, but a lot of patients are never invited to pre-screen or aware of trials. And I think honestly, if they're invited, I think a lot of patients would jump on the opportunity. A lot just aren't aware, and it goes back to kind of the awareness on the patient side. Is if they could be aware of trials happening that they would be eligible for, I think they'd likely accept. Generally speaking, maybe not all people, but outside from that, I think on the biomarker comprehensive genomic profiling side, um, when they have it done, it might be later into their care than then they can act on trials. So when trials are being spoken about and they're progressed on all of their so let's say standard lines of treatment, the window of them staying healthy and being able to get into a clinical trial diminishes pretty quickly. And I think if you have this earlier in their care, they can probably act on trials a bit quicker. So that's another point.
Those are excellent points, and very much reflect, right, especially in Canada, the overarching participation rates in trials, which is actually quite low. On average through the different provinces, it's around 4%. Jim, we'll turn it over to you and looking to get your perspective here on what the greatest barriers are with respect to preventing genomic information from being used more effectively to identify patients for clinical trials, and then to Dylan's point, how to connect them with appropriate targeted therapies earlier in their care.
So there are quite a few barriers, but none of them are unsurmountable. And we saw actually earlier today in one of the sessions with the clinicians about how they are navigating huge changes in data availability, testing availability, technology development. But that's a barrier in of itself. It's like, where do you jump in, right? So provincial health authorities tend to be, want to see the evidence, and there's a big difference between what we see in research labs, that you and I know all about, where you kind of see it's several years, you get a vision into the future, as it were, and it's not trivial to convert that or to even predict which technologies are going to make it into the clinic or which are suitable. Um, we Dylan touched on the very important element of clinical trials and engagement of patients in clinical trials. There are technologies and approaches being developed. There's one that we support along with Genome Canada and others called PMatch, which is a software suite which is meant to provide the oncologist with information they can provide to the patient. It essentially consumes or ingests the eligibility criteria for trials when they're posted. It combines that with the genomic as well as the clinical data associated with each patient, and then matches them basically, and then pushes that back to the oncologist to decide whether or not this is a trial that the patient may be interested in or that could be eligible for. And there are just not enough trials being conducted in Canada, especially with early stage trials, for example. And as you know, because BioCanRx is participating, the Cancer Research Society, ourselves, Terry Fox Research Institute, the Canadian Cancer Society have gotten together to help put resources into place to encourage more early stage investigator-initiated clinical trials in Canada. And it's kind of daunting, but also really encouraging that I think there's over 200 applications in the first round, which is going to be a bit of a nightmare, but it just shows that there's capacity if the funding is available. But we also need then to identify the patients and do that efficiently and effectively. And we know that patients on clinical trials tend to do better than patients who are just receiving standard of care. So, we need to get more patients on clinical trials. And the way to do that is to encourage more trials, fund more trials, and work with the biopharmaceutical sector to engage with our communities.
I couldn't agree with you more with respect to especially support for early stage trials. In Canada, we actually do very well in terms of attracting clinical trials from outside of our country, and something that we have not been as good at is early stage. And the point that I want to make here is it's so critically important to have those early stage trials to really be able to bring the best that science has to offer to patients here, which is why it's so important to have translational research programs and the accompanying clinical trials that will come out of those programs to be part of our response and arsenal. So and yes, and we're partners as well in the CRS initiative, and it's unbelievably exciting, but goes to show when there is funding available, the Canadian research and clinical community mobilizes and acts and is wanting to bring these clinical trials to patients across Canada. So thank you very much, Jim, for that. I'd like to turn it over to Yvonne and really to begin to discuss, real world evidence and GCP. And my question to you, Yvonne, is with respect to evidence and outcomes, and what should we be prioritizing from real-world genomic data to support patient-centered policy and system decision-making to ensure, adoption of these technologies into the Canadian healthcare systems, and to ensure that these types of technologies deliver meaningful benefit to patients here in Canada and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and to CCRAN for pulling us together. This is such a vital conversation and so exciting to hear about the leadership, both yourself, BioCran, Terry Fox, CCS, Canadian Cancer Society are working together to create this ecosystem. I focus on the two partners in that ecosystem that hopefully we can center on as well, which is the patients and the policymakers. I think that these kinds of efforts like PMAG and the innovation pipeline that is being supported is so fundamental to bring to the patients and the frontline clinicians as well. Because I think that what ends up happening is those opportunities unfortunately get sequestered in the academic tertiary centers, and questions of access to these trials when we get more of them, of course, is always an ongoing issue. But also empowering patients and those clinicians with the right information and understanding the eligibility criteria and offering alternative supports to include as many of our underserved and those who are served earlier in their treatment journeys to have the maximum benefits from these types of technologies and interventions that we have. So let me take a step back and maybe break this apart. When we think about real-world evidence generation, we have to think about taking a technology, let's call it a test, these profiling tests, and move it from what discovery research is so great at doing, which is developing this test, validating its clinical analytic components, and making sure it could be useful in a clinical context. And that's often the most important beginning of the evidence generation. But that's where we see a market drop off in terms of the efforts and the investment, and then the next elements of the trajectory to bring it into the healthcare system, which is looking at the right clinical trial endpoints that Health Canada and health technology or assessment or provincial authorities need to see before being able to then deem it safe and effective, and therefore potentially useful and cost-effective and implementable into practice. And those data points are different. And those designs of those studies are fundamentally very different than those upstream R&D that is done to develop and validate a test or tool. And that kind of data and design requires building out the types of outcomes that not only look at clinical utility, did this test and the information change the trajectory of care for the patient, open up trial opportunities, open up new therapies, and then the next step, change outcomes. Usually the cancer outcomes that are focused, the primary focus du jour, if you will, are about survival outcomes, progression-free survival, maybe quality of life, etc. But there is a slew of other patient-centered outcomes that are currently not the standard of what we actually measure in some of these clinical trials, which will actually be valued by health authorities as well as the clinicians and end users, such as our patients. And we don't actually have a handle on what is the minimal outcomes that need to be actually tracked in all of these trials. Of course, we understand progression-free survival, overall survival, hopefully quality of life, and other of those metrics. But what patients' values and some of the actual changes in their care and auxiliary care and lived experiences are not uniformly captured. And that can actually make a difference not only in the approval process for the health technology assessment or the Health Canada regulatory approval, but it will actually determine the value of when it's brought into the real world. Because if we don't know about some of the implementation challenges, the workflow challenges, some of the resources and capacity that we need in order to not only deliver that technology in the same way outside of that trial, but also for it to be scalable, accessible, and then actionable, okay? Then we undermine the actual value and the utility of the technology in the upfront. So there is this move now to be retooling and redesigning the outcomes and the design of these trials so that we are accruing that essential real-world health technology assessment evidence. And Marathon of Hope and the Terry Fox have actually made this a priority, and this will very much position us for success in order to deliver on that kind of evidence that is required for our decision-making community. But I also would recommend, and very much, that's the focus of my lab, which is also looking at the implementation and health service and patient needs and the clinician's needs on how to then, when they actually get access to this technology, we get that approved, we continue to see and maximize the value of those tests and the opportunities for treatment and actionability. We talk, Dylan shared his story about education, and then there's clinicians in the community will want to also join centralized trials and be able to maximize those opportunities. But how do we then, once we have that continuum where the ecosystem is built up, that we increase the opportunities to access to clinical trials, how do we also then reduce the burden on the clinicians to explain all of the intricacies of what's involved in the trials, what is actually the impacts to the patient, their family, and some of the potentially burdensome requirements that would be necessary, but also the benefits of participating and engender and empower patients to be as much a partner in that process, and also increase retention and the outcomes that we can actually start to track for these patients. And so that's really a motivation for the digital tools that we've been developing in order to support the scale up, the empowerment and retention, and the quality of the outcomes that we need. And that's some of the work that we've been doing with Genetics Advisor, again, with some of these communities of practice as well. But I also want to also make a shout out and maybe a call to action for some of the other jurisdictions that are thinking about how we bring innovation into the healthcare system. And Ontario has been a leader with their health innovation pathway as an example. So health technology assessment, once we get Health Canada approval, the technology is safe and effective, then it moves into the provinces and territories to determine, is it clinically useful? Is it cost effective? Can we bring this to the end users at scale? What do we need to set up into the system? But what we haven't thought about is the on-ramp and off-ramp after that HTA happens. Because just because we as a community of advisors tell the ministry, yes, this is ready to go, it has that clinical and cost effectiveness and implementation potential, it just drops. And often hospitals don't necessarily have the resources to fund a pilot or necessarily maintain the sustainability and the resources to continue a pilot. And that would be, from a hospital's perspective, hard to then remove a technology or remove access once they can't continue to fund it. So this is where the health innovation pathway in Ontario has been really a beacon into a really innovative new system to ensure what's made in Canada stays in Canada and brought to our patients by thinking about the on-ramp and even brokering some of the relationships of partnering with health systems as to who would be the appropriate test sites for the new solutions that are regulatorily approved, health technology assessment approved, but need a pathway to get into the system. And then after shown to be effective in the real world, a pathway to then off-ramp and maintain its accessibility in the system, and maybe even iterate it once we understand the real world intricacies of what's working, what's not working, so that we can iterate and maximize and optimize its delivery and outcomes from there. So I think that this ecosystem and the coordination around this is remarkably impressive, and shout out to CCRAN for being a real engine to get us all speaking together so we can build the system. And I think that the resources and the health authorities are now also coming on board with our patients as partners to make sure that we can optimize all of the investments that we're doing upstream with the R&D so that we can unlock the value of the potential and the outcomes for our patients downstream.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Yvonne. When you were speaking about, what we call, and I think this is the same parlance around the world, the last mile issue. I saw everybody on the panel just nodding, and this is I would say a universal issue. I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question. You've noted Ontario and the programs that they have put in place in order to bridge that gap, which is so critically important, right? I mean, yes, you can go through the regulatory approval, get, sign off from Health Canada, go through CDA, but it's really about, how do you actually make this work in the health system? Ontario has a program. Have you seen examples internationally of where, a country has really gotten their arms around this and demonstrated that they're able to move this forward?
Yeah, I would say two countries in particular. It would probably be the UK and Australia in the genomics space. I think that, I often sit there and wonder how can we be them, or how can we take some of those lessons learned? And what I've seen to be one of the instrumental key ingredients is that central championship and coordination, to be quite honest. In the UK, that makes sense because they have their healthcare system organized in that way and work very much in an integrated feedback loop between the ecosystem partners around the NHS, the genomic funding models, the innovation partners, as well as pharma, as well as thinking about arm's length communities to, manage some of those processes internally. And that has really, and then what you see there is a cascade of a healthcare system that is retooled to actually maximize on the potential. And they've done that in a structured way in the UK. Australia has also been a leader in this way by having, both state sponsorship of flagship pilots and then moving that research paradigm into the Ministry of Health to then to essentially create a sustainable pathway going forward for that innovation. So they recognize that the R&D and the discovery work is squarely appropriately funded and managed within the research ecosystem. But after a few, 10 years of showing the positive outcomes and the efficacy, they recognize that then now this gets handed into the healthcare system in order to maintain, sustain, and build the infrastructure that's going to be required to sustain that. And that's the kind of coordination, leadership, and also willingness to collaborate and bring our resources and our expertise. We just don't have enough people in Canada to continue on operating in silos. And we need to also understand that this takes partnerships with the folks upstream in terms of the builders, the solution creators, the evaluators, and then the end users, and understand all the pain points along the pathway. And like Ontario, try to be thinking, innovating, retooling the system in order to actually reduce those friction points.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that and for those examples that we can be inspired about. Jim, from your perspective, what do national genomic repositories, data sharing platforms, you've touched a little bit on this already in your remarks, what kind of role do these play in advancing a coordinated pan-Canadian research strategy? And what types of opportunities remain to better connect data, research, and innovation across jurisdictions?
So maybe I'll spend just a minute just describing something that we've been working on for 5 or 6 years now, and it's building on actually a number of pilot studies which had emerged from hospitals in Montreal, research institutes there, and in Ontario, and at Princess Margaret, and at the BC Cancer Research Institute, their personalized oncogenomics program. And so we saw that this is Terry Fox, saw that this was, things are moving quite quickly, but no one institution was really large enough and could capture enough patients from a research project perspective to really push things forward. And so we built this Marathon of Hope Cancer Centers Network, as it's called. It's 54 institutions from coast to coast. And recently we just closed the first phase of that, and we'd done genomic profiling for whole genome sequencing on 16,776 patients, including very comprehensive clinical data in about 140 fields, as well as technologies such as transcriptomics. So it was very comprehensive. And that sounds really impressive, but it's 16,776 cases over 5 years, where we have approximately 250,000 new cases diagnosed in Canada every year. So that's the difference between research and practice, right? So research cannot deliver the care. It can build evidence, as Yvonne mentioned, and that's what we need to do more of. But what the network showed us is that actually by working together, and I think it is quite unique, the whole country came together, we could do this. And the cost for the sequencing, the cost for the analysis, the time, the turnaround time, all of those were reduced remarkably over the term of the project. We started off with retrospective analysis. So this was where a patient had been diagnosed, they've gotten their standard of care, they've gotten their treatments, some were on clinical trials, and they also had their tumors banked. So we could analyze the tumors and look at also the outcome. So how did the outcome correlate with the particular therapies that they've been treated with? And also, how did that relate to their genomic and clinical data? What we realized, though, was that that's all good. You need to do that to start off, right? To get ideas for what's working, what's not working. But out of those 16,000 patients, just over 5,000 were actually enrolled prospectively. So they were patients who were newly diagnosed, and not only that, the advances in the analysis, the analytical pipelines, which were they're a real block to getting information back to the oncologist in time to actually make a treatment decision, which is going to impact potentially the outcome of the choice of treatment, the so-called return of results. That was getting down to about 10 business days, which is sufficiently rapid to then influence the outcome of, or the optimization of the therapeutic options for the oncologist to give to the patients. So we realize that, geez, there's a lot of excitement around individualized medicine, treating the patient as an individual, taking into consideration their individual characteristics, not just their genomic information, but also their clinical data, their etiology, their development, how they develop the cancer, all those sorts of things, and could then do this prospectively. So we're just about to launch actually the second phase of this program, which is done in collaboration with Health Canada. And this, and Yvonne alluded to this, and she's been involved in the first phase as well. But we realize that we can actually build these pipelines using structures, data structures, by educating, helping to inform the clinicians to train the next generation of health informaticians and bioinformaticians who we don't have enough of. Also, the continuous education of those clinicians who graduated medical school, many, many years before even the human genome was first sequenced, which was only 25 years ago, and be able to look at, experiment as to what are the best practices to bring this into standard of care. How do we convince the provincial health authorities that, as Yvonne said, that these technologies are ready and have better outcomes, but also are affordable and effective? And that's not trivial. That's when we talk about that research to implementation gap, that's what it's all about. So we have to work with the provinces to understand the type of information, the type of evidence they want to bring to the table. What we've done, though, by having this national program, we have standards, we set standards. And it's not me, or it's not any one other individual. It's working groups of experts across the country who are looking at best practices, who are evaluating technologies, who are comparing themselves to each other to bring themselves up in terms of the quality of the work they can do, and also to listen to the clinicians about what data and they want and how to interpret it. And we also, in the second phase, we really have been pushing to, this is not any good if it's only going to be delivered in downtown Toronto or Vancouver. This has to be, Canada prides itself on its socialized medicine. We need to make this available to patients no matter where they live and no matter what cancer they've been diagnosed with. So, equity is a really important lens in this respect. And from the federal government's perspective, of course, that's critical. So these are the other really, really, really important component of this are the patients. And we have just a phenomenal patient working committee, a working group. We were so impressed with the guidance they were giving us and the feedback, but also the urgency that they convey. We sit in our research labs doing our research and writing grants and what have you, but the patients are living this every day. And tomorrow's too late. So they bring together this urgency, which is incredibly inspiring. We were so impressed. We also actually devoted part of our research budget to a competition which they ran. They were guided by scientists. In fact, the two co-chairs of the panel of the working group are patients who are also scientists, and they did a phenomenal job. So they went out and said, these are the questions which are important to us. They gave us, they came back with research proposals to address those questions, and they adjudicated the whole thing. So this was patient involvement, I think, to the extreme, and it's amazing. We're going to do another one in phase 2, another competition, because it was so impactful. And I think that's where, as mentioned before by other panelists earlier today, that the patients are actually not only a critical stakeholder in this whole process, but also they're our biggest champions and our biggest assets, because when we go to Ottawa and talk to the politicians, they talk to the patients. They don't really, we as scientists have all sorts of jargon. The patients are far more compelling. They give specific examples. And so they're a tremendous asset. And they also bring the urgency to the question. So it's, I've been working in cancer research basically all my life. We're seeing this implementation of molecular technologies based on both genomic technologies, but also many others. And it's really exciting, but we have to understand the patient before we can make decisions about what is the best treatment for them. And that's the mechanism that we need to transform into practice. And it's going to be, it's a big lift, but I really do think we're not only on the cusp, we need to convert those 16,000 patients to the 240,000 patients who are seen newly diagnosed every year, as well as the patients with metastatic disease, of course, which is another area which we should talk about, which is it doesn't stop at the primary treatment. And actually, I think was it Dylan mentioned this earlier, in terms of when we often these new therapies are when we treat patients, they've exhausted the standard of care. We're putting these new therapies through the most extreme conditions where patients have developed additional mutations in their cancer, which are going to be much more difficult to treat. Whereas earlier on, we know earlier treatment is better, and if these treatments are more effective when you don't have all of the other sequelae, and also the health of the patient has been put under enormous pressure through the standard of care. So we need to accelerate this for patients at first presentation, but also if they have recurrence of their disease. And monitoring that, the technologies are there. Liquid biopsies are just, 10 years ago, it was a sort of pipe dream. This is now being implemented. So I think it's incredibly disheartening to get a diagnosis of cancer, but these technologies are there and we need to move them into the clinic.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you for all of the work that you do. And thank you also for sharing the work that you've done with patients and really putting patients in charge of a research competition. And I've heard about it, and it sounds incredibly exciting. And kudos for doing this and engaging and including patients, throughout the research that Terry Fox is supporting. I'd like to turn it over to our international panelists and to also include views that are from outside Canada, and really to draw upon the contrast that exists, or maybe does not exist to the extent that I have in my own mind. But the question here is about US and Canadian approaches to integrating CGP into clinical and translational research. And we'd like to understand from your experience, Arvind, as a principal investigator at MD Anderson, what types of research models have been most effective in integrating genomic testing into clinical and translational research from where you sit in the US?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on the panel today. Is incredible insight so far. In being the only non-Canadian on the panel, I guess today, I'll start off with a very brief introduction about myself. I'm a medical oncologist at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas, and I've been involved in incorporating biomarkers into the care of colorectal cancer patients across a patient's journeys from early stage to late stage. Maybe what I can do today is share our experience incorporating liquid biopsies and specifically testing of minimal residual disease and early stage colon cancer that's been brought up a couple of times during the conversation today. Starting with the first question of perhaps the main difference between the Canadian and the US environments, perhaps the access and availability to these tests. For instance, MRD testing, ctDNA testing is available for clinical use here in the US. And that was based on fairly limited data, but this went to CMS, that once CMS approves a test, then that is covered by commercial insurances as well. So it's the government's approval through CMS that then allows commercial insurances to cover these tests. So I think that is what led to the availability of these ctDNA liquid biopsies in the early stage disease setting for minimal residual disease testing. So once this approval came through, acknowledging the incredibly powerful prognostic implications of this technology, for instance, early studies suggested and confirmed subsequently that uh, patients who are positive for these tests are many-fold at a higher risk of developing recurrence as compared to those who test negative, even if everything else is kind of uh, similar between these patients. So we really tried to stay at the forefront of these developments, and kind of what really worked for us at MD Anderson. Really want to highlight what Ron had pointed out, in that this change should be at the system level. It cannot be at a provider or a patient level, and there should be a central coordination effort beyond one person, one group. So it's kind of, this was a concerted institutional effort that was rolled out because we really need to figure out how the order sets and the EMR are going to be developed, where are the results going to flow through, how are providers going to view these results. So it really need kind of a system level approach. The second thing that, again, want to highlight what Dylan said, was the key, absolutely important piece of education. When patients and families are hit by the diagnosis of cancer, it is a state of panic. And they are trying to reach out desperately for answers. So kind of helping them, guiding them, look, these are the pieces of information we really need to be efficient, to make decisions. So what we did was our kind of access center folks, who are the first kind of reach to patients, who are the ones who talk to the patients first. And subsequently, we also have other team members, intake navigators, who liaison with the patients as well. So all these people who first talk to the patients and families, even way before a provider ever talks to them, they inform the patient, hey, these are the pieces of information we need. And that absolutely includes molecular information and the ctDNA tests as well. And the third thing is having access to these tests, right? So it in a timely fashion, because the clock is ticking. We need to make decisions quickly, get patients on trials. So we make sure that the patients are aware of this information, see if they're able to get these tests done even before they come to see us. If not, we're actually now in conversations to actually pilot an effort where even before a patient comes to our institution, we are actually drawing blood and sending off these tests, so that by the time the patient comes to the clinic, we have this information already. So I think that's the next piece, kind of really having access. Beyond that, I mean, perhaps the most important piece of all this is what are we going to do with that information? How is that actionable? How are we using that information to change the patient's care and improve it? So matching the patient's information to what trials are available. So for patients at MD Anderson, we developed a kind of a navigation team, as kind of a trial navigation team is what we call. They're looking at patient profiles, looking at all the information and saying, hey, based on this information, these are the potential trials available. Please discuss with the patient when you see them. Or it could be the other way around. The provider reaches out and says, you have a patient who needs a trial, what's available? And so they are working in the background, identifying these trials. They proactively reach out to the patients, inform them, and kind of make sure that they're aware of all the opportunities with regards to trials. And this is all kind of in the present, but equally important is kind of looking to the future and how can we continue to improve on things so that loop between practice to research and back to practice is critical. And for that, what you need are well-curated, large-scale databases, as Jim outlined, that we could go back, ask questions, learn from, and kind of design the next wave of trials, next wave of research that can drive the science forward. And we've done that for these patients. We've initiated small clinical trials based on lessons we've learned over the past few years. Some have been successful, some have not been successful, but still, I think it's a continuous learning process. And I think this entire approach is absolutely required to not just generate data, but kind of transform that into information, subsequently knowledge, and actionable wisdom that we can use for taking care of our patients.
Thank you so much for that description of the work that you're doing. And I have so many follow-up questions. With respect to your earlier point on scalability, these are approaches that you are putting into place at MD Anderson. What does it mean, for example, for the state of Texas?
Yeah, and I think that's where having buy-in from, I guess, state level governments and things like that are important, because everything is still siloed. As well-meaning as people and institutions are, there are regulations that unfortunately put us into silos that are somewhat isolated. Information cannot move from one silo to another. Patients cannot move easily from one silo to another. So those restrictions are still there. So what we're doing here at MD Anderson is trying to build networks of institutions where, at least to a certain extent, these silos are broken down, and we have channels of communication available where information is flowing back and forth and collaborations are happening. But it's not easy for one institution or one person to do it. And this absolutely needs to be a central authority with enough pull to be able to do this.
Thank you very much, Arvind. And I see so many similarities, so many parallels, and also same sounding solutions. And I'd like to turn it over to Jim, and really drawing upon the experience of Terry Fox Research Institute and what you had described at this phase 2 part of the Marathon of Hope Cancer Center Network. What lessons have emerged about integrating genomics into clinical trials and translational research, and where do you see the greatest opportunities to strengthen collaboration across Canada?
So I think, so, I don't want to be nationalistic about this, and I also, given what's going on in the US, Arvind, we understand, hang in there with NIH and NCI. It's tough, and we're the American Health Research sector has driven progress in the world, and we take a lot of guidance from them. But Canadians are pretty good at collaborating. They've always been good at collaborating, and we don't seem to have so many barriers, with a couple of exceptions. I'll come to those in a second. And one of my colleagues, I give this anecdote. Ben Neal, who was head of research at the Princess Margaret, said to me, he came from Boston. He said, in Boston, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy, and we are very competitive, right? So Arvin mentioned silos. There are regulatory silos, but there are also professional silos, and it's sometimes easier to do something within an institution where you have control, things like the ethics committees and what have you, than it is to do across institutions or across the country. However, I think we've been able to do that, and people come together partly because in this day and age you cannot do research anymore in the way that I used to do it 40 years ago, where you would look at maybe 5 samples, and now you need thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of samples or data from patients. So that is sort of caused people to really rethink. We have to work together. Unfortunately, we're still pretty selfish about our data. We generate the data as scientists, and we want to analyze it. We generate it. We should get first shot at it, which is fine. Except, so maybe do that for a month or a couple of months, but you need to share the data, and that's not trivial, especially when it comes to health data, because health data is, you have privacy, security. This is confidential information. It's owned by the patients, who then give the jurisdiction of that, the protection of that data to the institutions, such as the hospitals. And our hospitals are risk averse. We've all heard terrible stories about data breaches. So we have to be very, very careful about this precious data. And but that becomes then an excuse not to share it. So we've also been building a program called a platform, actually called the Digital Health and Discovery Platform, which is where the data doesn't move, right? So Arvin's data, MD Anderson, stays behind the MD Anderson firewalls. And of course, we're doing this in Canada. We'll collaborate with you anytime, Arvin. And so you have that level of security is sort of built in. Privacy is sort of the first step. But then it allows you to, especially using machine learning, AI technologies, to query that data and understand, for example, with biomarkers, I've got a clinical trial. I need to find out where the patients are who might be best matched to that clinical trial. And then you don't know who those patients are, but it's in the system. So you can say, well, actually at the university, sorry, the BC Cancer Agency, there are 15 patients. I can contact them, talk to them. So this is what we really need to do to break down these sort of somewhat artificial but understandable barriers. And Canada is no better than any other country in putting these barriers up. Having said that, we also need to I think we're preaching to the converted in many respects. The clinicians you've had on and has been participating over the past 2 days all understand the tremendous opportunity and promise and potential of genomic analysis, but they're not necessarily representative of the majority of our clinical colleagues. And so we need to help make it easier for them through education, through opportunities, but also through processes, right? They're very bright, intelligent people, but they're very busy. So we have to reduce the barrier to entry to understanding in a way. And this is what Yvonne was alluding to. So they can be a barrier. And I've encountered this directly, with oncologists who, throughout their careers have been told the next greatest thing is coming out of research, and they don't see it. So, they're skeptical, and I don't blame them, right? They don't want to promise things to patients which they can't deliver. So we have to build that case in multiple ways. And I think also we have another potential advantage, Arvind may disagree with me, and I think actually the HMO system in the US is could help with this as well. In that we have our provinces. We think about, we have our nationalized medicine and health programs, but the provinces are who deliver that care, and they set the budgets and they set their priorities. So that's a natural experiment. We aren't going to get them all to be agreeing to everything right from the beginning, but we can work with each of the individual provinces to make the case. And we have to take them, we can't dictate to them. They have to say to us, what information they need from us, and how can we help them. And this is an enormous issue in Canada because, again, we have people living in the northern parts of the provinces, in the Northwest Territories, in Nunavut, and they don't have the same standard of care or access to care as we do in the metropolitan South. So we need to work out ways to help deliver this, and I think there are lots of solutions, and we need to. And one solution isn't going to fit all problems. So this is an opportunity for us to understand that variety and diversity of approaches, where we can actually find the appropriate solutions in the same way we're trying to do now with individual patients. So we shouldn't consider the healthcare system as monolithic. Our provincial healthcare authorities are under tremendous fiscal and other pressures. We need to work with them and to understand and provide potential solutions to them. And just as one example, Yvonne, we've been working with Yvonne. What we found was in the Marathon Hope Network data that 10% of our patients had, or at least 10%, had familial mutations, right? So there's then a duty to inform the patients and their siblings and those who are closely genetically related, because they may also be carriers. And we need to identify those people. But at the same time, you can't, and Yvonne's the expert in this, you're dropping a bomb on them. It's in terms of information. So this has to be done professionally through genetic counseling. And we have so few genetic counselors in this country that we need to find solutions which are not going to create yet more problems. So, it's a holistic approach. I think we need to understand how practically to transfer the amazing progress which has been made over the past decade or two into practical solutions. And that is what scientists are not terribly good at.
Thank you, Jim, for those remarks. And before moving on to the audience questions, and there are quite a few in the chat that I see, Dylan, I'd like to ask you this question. So we've been speaking about data and the challenges around data. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as a patient about all of the issues that exist here. When we speak to patients, when a number of my clinician and research colleagues speak to patients, the assumption is that of course this data is being used, it's being shared for to benefit my healthcare and my treatment. Can I ask what your thoughts are about these challenges that exist in Canada?
Yeah, to be super honest, before getting into the cancer space, I was really surprised that there aren't already these national registries across the entire country that any researcher can pull from. I mean, every single genomic test, like how many, patients are KRAS and CRC versus some other, I'm surprised that wasn't already in place, just given, I think we're a lot more advanced from a finance side or investing standpoint, and in terms of a lot of those types of databases that we have access to. As a patient, I'm more, I'd highly prefer my information being sent to as many people as possible that want to look at it. I'd be surprised at the mass majority of patients. I've spoken to a lot of patients over the past 2 years, and I think the overwhelming majority want their data to be used for the benefit of research. So I don't think this is a patient wanting their data kept to one silo of a spot at all. I see it more as just trying to kind of break down those barriers, and ideally having kind of, again, a national or kind of one institution pulling in that scale. So this is easier to do than, multiple smaller players trying to get smaller databases put into one. So.
Yes, agreed. And a number of investments have been made in the past few months with respect to data. So, for example, Vital, CaiHi, all looking to achieve this goal for patients. And so, ensuring that patients, and of course patients are at the forefront in the creation and launch of all of these initiatives, but ensuring that your voice is very present and very clear is critically important to extracting the most value that we're going to get, so that we can turn things around and do things as quickly as possible for patients. So so believe it or not, we have been speaking to each other now for the past hour. And as I mentioned at the top of the hour, the last 15 minutes are, of course, reserved to engage with the audience that is listening in. And so we have several questions here in the chat. And I would like to begin with the very first one here. And panelists, please chime in, excuse me. And the question goes as follows. It's very disappointing when many clinical trials are limited to first line only. What about us folks, and we spoke about this, in second line and beyond? And what about those folks? Really has to do with the different types of criteria that are used in the trials. Dr. Dasari.
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think access to clinical trials is a huge issue, given how tightly regulated they are. Even if a trial is available, just the logistics of being able to travel to where it's available on a frequent basis, staying there for more than a day or two, often to get all the testing done, is a huge issue. So I think that to me is a big barrier. And we keep talking about decentralized trials and having remote care being embedded into these trials, that those efforts have just started and hopefully will take off. With regards to the specific question of line of therapy and trials available within colorectal cancer, and I must say this is true across all of oncology, novel drug development tends to start in the refractory setting and then tends to move to early lines of therapy. So there are ways, depending on where in that movement drugs are being developed. So perhaps right now there aren't a lot of second line trials, but that shouldn't be the case for very long as these trials are being these drugs are being moved.
And it really underscores, prior points that have been made with respect to, to your point on refractory patients on earlier stage clinical trials being highly beneficial. Any other comments from other members?
Yes, definitely. I think one area which you think is really important is that, traditionally clinical trials have been directed at a particular disease or a particular diagnosis, for example. And I think with molecular oncology now, with precision oncology, we realize that if you've got a molecularly targeted drug, if that targeted molecule has been mutated and is important as a driver to a cancer, no matter where it is, it's going to respond. So this is how drugs and proteins work. So getting away from this idea of clustering around a particular. It's important because it's difficult to get, if you like, off-label use. So you've got a particular, a very effective therapy which is used for example, in breast cancer, you can't just simply apply it to another cancer without going through a whole bunch of, and usually not through a trial, through a whole rigmarole. That is starting to change with basket trials and other types of trials. With immuno-oncology, N=1 trials we've seen with cancer vaccines, as you well know. So I think that's where I see the probably the things that the tide is turning. And so this is why it's so important to be, what's missing sometimes is not that there isn't a trial available. It's that you've got to match the patient. And is a patient in a metastatic setting getting a genomic analysis being done on their disease? And if not, then they aren't going to be eligible de facto. So that's what needs to change. But I do think we're moving in the right direction, but everything needs to be done more expeditiously.
Yes, and I would just echo on that, because on the policy side of the house, once you need a companion diagnostic to identify and stratify patients for the appropriate therapy in a trial or otherwise, then the evaluation of that therapy is linked to the test. And we have mechanisms to evaluate the therapy and the test, but not them together. And sometimes the funding that would be made available covers the therapy and not the test. And so we also, from an ecosystem perspective and from that sort of closed loop model, need to be thinking about, alternative models of developing the real world early evidence and sponsorship of the testing that then stratifies and identifies the therapies. And this is where, again, our pharma and other ecosystem partners have recognized some of that, some of those gaps, and have, created some sponsorship opportunities that really partnered, understanding that there are those system level challenges, to then develop and then sponsor some of the identification tools like those genomic profile tests, in order to then unlock some of the opportunities for treatment and then collect the health technology and outcomes data that we need. So this is exactly the kind of conversations and de-siloing that we need to do, and partnership of recognizing that we all are in this together and can solve this if we actually start to develop that trust, have the transparency of goals, articulate the pathway, and all of those pain points, so that we can then coordinate in a coordinated fashion.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And along the same line, the second question that's in the chat is very much along those lines. And I don't know if you will have anything else to add. And it has to do with the conference, what was presented at the conference yesterday on GCP costs and benefits analysis. And which demonstrated, and we've seen this presentation, that universal GCP for metastatic patients could result in meaningful gains in life years and save healthcare dollars. Do you have any comments to make about that? That is the question from the audience. Do the panelists have any direct comments to make about that statement?
I would just first congratulate CCRAN and their partners for championing the evidence. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. And now we need to build more of it, but also the channels to get into the right hands, so that we can start to build the pathways for increasing access, and also the coordination of that testing pathway, treatment pathway, empowering our patients, our clinicians, in order to then create those outcomes and ensure that the value for money at that path, not just in the modeling, but actually in the real world. So it's exactly the kind of steps in the right directions. And I welcome my fellow panelists to add their comments as well.
I could not agree more. And the costs of sequencing will continue to go down over time. They already have, but will continue to do so. And it is also hard to put a price tag on future discoveries that we don't know of as yet. Just in the past month to 6 weeks, it's been incredibly inspiring to see the breakthroughs in pancreatic cancer treatment. I mean, the holy grail of oncology for so long. I mean, we're finally kind of making kind of significant headway in finding that. So I think absolutely all for universal testing.
Thank you for that, Arvind. The next question is with respect to the clinician roundtable and specifically a call to action for the standard of care. And certainly this is very much close to my heart, very much echoed by several physicians that we have the good fortune of working with. And it's a call for the standard of care to include an opportunity for patients to participate in research. And I think I know what the answer from all of you will be. Do you panelists agree? But then is the clincher, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What actions can be taken to move the needle there? Because we, and you know, in parlance coming out of the Ottawa Hospital where BioCanRx is located, the tagline "Research is Care," really embodying, you know, that melding together of standard of care with research, is very much at the heart of what they do. But we all know that on the ground, this is something that's difficult to achieve, and we've spoken a little bit about different solutions. But I'd like to hear, as we're coming to a close on this session, about additional actions that can be taken to move the needle to make that happen.
I don't want to put this on the patients because they're going through enough, but it is, as I mentioned before, your voice, their voice is so powerful, and it's very difficult to ignore. And you know, organizations like CCRAN are doing their part on this. But I do think, you know, ultimately, you know, we spend, in terms of health research, the amount we spend compared with what we deliver through healthcare delivery through the provinces, and this is just the same in the US and elsewhere, is a tiny fraction, right? So we can point to a better future, but we need our healthcare delivery funders to recognize and to move with the times, and to realize that outcomes can't wait. Better outcomes are possible, and so it's not a question. You know, we know how to scale this. This is, as Arvind mentioned, the technology is getting cheaper, it's getting more robust. It's the systems have been put together, and other countries are already doing this. So you know, it's time we didn't follow, and we in fact were pioneers. And I think that's the message. Hopefully that the federal government understands, but it's not the federal government who ultimately is really funding and making those decisions.
I think the fact that clinic research, that infinity loop is so key. And I think that that's exactly where the next tagline, you know, precision medicine, personalized medicine, we start to change our mindset. I think that those of us on this call, on this panel, within our echo chamber appreciate that. And certainly the federal government's investment in initiatives like Marathon of Hope is starting to trickle into that reality. But to Jim's point, you know, the folks that need to fund and build the infrastructure are at the provincial and territorial levels. And the folks that bear the burden of navigating absent of that system are the patients and the clinicians. The clinicians don't have an obvious way to keep abreast of the new trials and the eligibility criteria. And the patients that go to Dr. Google and find all of those trials and bring them to their clinician then create more of both opportunities for clarification, but also opportunities to also go down rabbit holes, both with the clinician and the patient. So we need to really be thinking not only about the structures from the system, but also how to, as I've mentioned, empower the patients with the information, as well as the clinicians with effective and efficient tools so that they can navigate those conversations in real time, while also reserving that time for very important patient-centric care delivery as well. So there's so much happening in that consult for the clinician, for the oncologist and the patient. The oncologist is trying to keep up with all the opportunities and sift through the eligibility criteria, and so are the patients. And we need to be thinking about solutions to empower those conversations, think about decentralizing those opportunities offline without unnecessarily taking the time on the consult, and be thinking about innovative models of not only service delivery, but research delivery within the services. And that's why I'm so passionate about some of the solutions that we're building with the Marathon of Hope, outside of that with Genetics Advisor, and we really need to be thinking about optimizing that for various different use cases.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's really about making it as easy and streamlined as possible for the multitude of different users, and having a backend that is highly effective in being able to do that. Arvind and Dylan, any comments with respect to that opportunity to participate in research, and what actions can we take in order to move that needle?
I completely agree with what Jim and Yvonne have really outlined. I think the key is to take the burden away from patients and their families. They're already dealing with a lot. I think just kind of having these conversations and having these central authorities that can engender change at the system country level, I think is what is key.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dylan, you have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everybody on this. I think as a patient, of course, you want to at least have the option to participate in research. I think it's giving patients more options and the opportunity to decide for themselves with, advisory and recommendation from their oncologist if, the standard of care or a certain trial that has great or unknown results is kind of the way to go for their specific situation. So, once again, I hope that that's something we see in the future.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to turn it back over to Cassandra and Phil, and thank you. And thank you to CCRAN for your incredible leadership in this space.
Thank you. That was a great discussion with some tangible opportunities to really reduce that research to implementation gap. And ultimately, that will bring Canadian cancer patients the best that science has to offer, as Stephanie, you opened with.